Welcome, Forever Buffs, both alumni and current students. Thank you so much for joining us for this exciting installment of the Forever Buff Spotlight series. The Forever Buff Spotlight program highlights alumni, students, faculty, and staff that are making a positive impact in their industry or community. This program aims to build pride and connection with CU Boulder and the incredible community that we are all a part of. Tonight's event is brought to you by the CU Boulder Alumni Association, New Student and Family Programs, and the Herd. We have a big audience joining us this evening, so hello to all of you that are joining on Zoom and Facebook Live. For those of you on Zoom, please feel free to use the chat to send your questions to Emily for our Q&A following her talk. For those on Facebook Live, please post your questions in the feed and we will work to get those questions answered as well. Because there are so many of you joining, we aren't sure we will be able to answer all of your questions, but we will do our best. Before I introduce our special guest, I want to introduce myself. My name is Capitan. I am currently a junior at CU Boulder studying political science, economics, and international affairs. I'm also the professional development chair of the Herd Leadership Council. The Herd is the student arm of the Alumni Association, and this is my third year serving on the council. I'm super excited to speak with Emily and all of you tonight. Emily Harrington is a professional rock climber and adventurer who has been a prominent and leading figure in the climbing community since she was a teenager. Her early years were defined by her successes on the USA climbing team on the national and world competition circuit, including 5 national sport climbing championships and 2 North American championships. Emily's true passions lie with outdoor climbing and exploring the mountains. Since shifting her focus from competition, Emily has established numerous first female ascents of 5.14 sport routes, summited Everest, and has been on expeditions all over the world attempting big wall free climbs and high altitude peaks in Nepal, China, Myanmar, Crimea, and Morocco. In 2020, Emily achieved a lifelong dream and career milestone, becoming just the 4th woman ever to free climb El Capitan in a day, and the first to do so on the famed Golden Gate route. Emily currently resides in Squaw Valley, California, where she trains for climbing and has fallen in love with skiing. Here's Emily Harrington.
Thanks so much, Kavya. Hello, everyone. I'm really psyched to be here. I'm psyched to share a little bit of my story with you guys. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this all works. Bear with me. All right, here we go. My name is Emily Harrington. I am a professional rock climber. I have spent the majority of my life crafting my passion for climbing into a career and dedicating myself to become the best athlete that I can be in the vertical world. I'm here today with you to share my story, a little bit about why I do what I do, what drives me to do hard things, find my limit and push beyond it, and to keep going when things seem impossible. So I'm going to start at the beginning. I actually grew up in Boulder, born and raised, and I discovered climbing when I was 10 years old, actually at the Boulder Reservoir. And then I went to the Boulder Rock Club. And I remember when I first climbed, I had this really bizarre sense of fear, but also almost belonging at the same time. It was like I felt the fear, but I was able to push past it and continue climbing. And even at age 10, that felt really powerful to me. I was one of the first generations of climbing kids who essentially grew up in the climbing gym. So meaning climbing on an artificial wall indoors on plastic holds, using a rope in case of a fall. It's what we call free climbing, meaning using only your hands and feet to ascend and a rope and protection in case of a fall. As a result, I started doing climbing competitions at a really early age. The objective of a climbing competition is to solve the puzzle and find your path up the wall. The routes, as we call them, are created to be difficult, and it's a really simple premise. Whoever gets the highest wins. Into my teenage years, I was completely focused on climbing competitions. I became a national champion sport climber 5 times from ages 16 to 23. And then I went to compete on the World Cup circuit. consistently placing in finals and landing myself on the podium. Parallel to my success in competitions, I was also drawn to climbing outdoors on real rock, and I became really passionate for a discipline called sport climbing. Sport climbing involves climbing one rope length, we call them pitches, off the ground, so around 80 to 100 feet. And the routes are given grades depending on the difficulty of the movements. And for me, this translated really well as someone coming from the climbing gym because it's very similar to the climbing gym. The protection is pre-placed, it's a very safe form of climbing, and it's still very focused on the physical aspect. And I absolutely love sport climbing. I began to travel the world sport climbing, seeking out the hardest routes and pushing myself. And still today, it's one of my main and most favorite styles of climbing. I find the whole process of finding a route, solving the puzzle, and figuring out your own way up to be completely fascinating. It's always different, it's always interesting, and it's always mentally and physically challenging. This photo is actually from one of my very first trips to Asia. I went to China and was climbing on something called the Great Arch, which is a pretty wild experience for me. All of this, competitions and climbing outdoors, sport climbing, was happening in my teens. And as I got in my late teens, I became a student at CU. I studied international affairs with an emphasis on sub-Saharan African politics. And so I was juggling my time at CU and my time in university with a climbing career, and it really was a true balancing act for me. I remember my final 2 years, so my junior and senior years at CU, I scheduled all of my classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays so that I could travel Friday to Monday and climb outdoors or go to competitions. And I would say probably one of the most important things I learned through going to college was how to time manage and how to prioritize the things that are most important to me. This photo was taken at World Championships in 2005 in Munich, Germany. I was there for a long weekend from school, and I placed second. I graduated in 2007 with honors, magna cum laude, and I had the intention of taking the LSAT and going to law school. I wanted to study international law. But at the same time, I was approached by the North Face, and I was asked to be a member of their global athlete team, which completely derailed my plan to continue my education. I truly loved being a student, and I really wanted to continue to learn, but I saw this sponsorship as an opportunity to travel the world and experience new places using climbing as my vehicle. So instead of law school, I was sort of launched into this professional climbing career, which enabled me to not only travel, but to explore other styles of climbing. At the time, I was feeling pretty burned out on climbing competitions and the constant pressure of training and performing. And like anyone who had just graduated, I felt like the world was at my fingertips, and I really wanted to explore it. I wanted to experience the world, and I wanted to have an adventure. And climbing became my vehicle for that. I still loved it. I truly loved it, but I wanted to explore it outside of this tiny niche of competitions and sport climbing. I wanted to diversify, and I saw that as a way for me to explore what climbing meant to me and why I chose this life, why I chose this path. And thanks to the North Face, I was given the opportunity to travel to places like the Himalaya in Nepal. This photo is from my first trip in 2011. It's the first time I experienced altitude. It's the first time I was really in the big mountains and felt the power of being in those mountains. And I saw the true adventure side of climbing as opposed to just the performance side. This mountain is called Ama Dablam. It's one of the most beautiful mountains I've ever seen. And I managed to go back and climb it in 2013. So I started climbing big mountains and going on expeditions in big mountains. I even managed to reach the summit of Mount Everest in 2012, along with the North Face team. And that proved to be honestly one of the most trying experiences of my life for a variety of reasons. One of the biggest things Everest taught me was how to suffer for long periods of time. It wasn't technically difficult like I was used to. There's no problem solving like I was used to in rock climbing. It's really just one foot in front of the other for a really long period of time, coupled with this excruciating pain of being at high altitude. So on Everest, I learned about type 2 fun, which is the fun that you feel after it's all over. Throughout this time of diversifying, I was still completely in love with hard rock climbing and with the styles that I had practiced when I was younger. I loved the creativity of it. I loved the challenge of it. I loved the details of it and how obsessed I would become with the individual movements and just the head games that I would play with myself, the failure and the struggle. So no matter how many times I went to the mountains, I always returned to the rock. And then I discovered big wall free climbing. So that is climbing big, massive walls where you don't return to the ground for hours or even days at a time. You ascend with a partner. So one person leading until they reach the end of the rope, and then they bring the second person up, and then that person goes, and you kind of like leapfrog all the way up. To me, it felt like the ideal combination between adventure and hard rock climbing. And I started to seek out those kinds of objectives all over the world. This photo was taken in the Verdon Gorge in France. It's this giant limestone gorge that's over 1,000 feet tall, and it's one of the birthplaces of rock climbing. I was there in 2014. The most famous big wall in the world actually happens to me right in my backyard. It's El Capitan in Yosemite. And it's so iconic due to its sheer size and steepness and difficulty. It is 3,200 feet of granite. And it's also the birthplace of American rock climbing. For decades, climbers have tested themselves in Yosemite Valley, but El Cap in particular has been reserved for the most elite, especially when it comes to free climbing, which I defined before, meaning using only your hands and feet to ascend and a rope or protection in case of a fall. El Cap is super famous now in the mainstream for the movie Free Solo, where a man named Alex Honnold climbed a route on El Cap with no ropes. And yes, that is completely insane, even to rock climbers. It was a huge groundbreaking achievement. And free climbing is much different than free soloing in that the risk of death is not certain if you fall, but it's similar in that you are only using your hands and feet to ascend. In 2015, after years of climbing smaller big walls, I decided I was ready to attempt a free ascent on El Cap. There are about 15 or so routes or paths, as we call it, routes up El Cap. Some of them are harder than others, but they're all hard. The route I had in mind is a route called Golden Gate. It's drawn in red in this photo. And the way that it works is the first people to go up there, they seek out weaknesses in the rock that they can hold onto in order to ascend. And ironically, as you can see in the photo, sometimes that requires going down. Living in the vertical world it's hard and it's weird. There are a lot of logistics that you don't often think of, and everything takes energy. So making food, sleeping, eating, going to the bathroom, not dropping things. It's a whole thing. And you're constantly doing something even when you're not climbing. Not only do you need to have a specific set of skills yourself, but you also need someone there to support you and climb with you who also has those skills, as well as a person who can be there for you when it gets really hard emotionally, to sort of lift you up and believe in you when you can't, or maybe when you choose not to. I chose my partner in life, Adrian Ballinger, to be my partner for my first time up El Cap. He is a high altitude climber, a skier, and a mountain guide, and honestly, my biggest supporter. In 2015, I really struggled with the style of climbing on Golden Gate. There's honestly no way to train for the really slippery, insecure, physical and technical style of climbing that is climbing on El Cap without actually climbing on El Cap. It's this really smooth glacier polished granite, like nothing I've ever experienced before. And for me, it was my first time. And there was a lot of styles of climbing that I wasn't familiar with. This section in this photo in particular is about halfway up the wall. It's 1,500 feet off the ground. And it's this giant wide crack that you have to wedge your body into and just sort of like squirm your way up. It's about 100 feet long. And this section took me 2.5 hours to complete because I really didn't understand or know how or have the proper technique. And I got pretty banged up as a result. A lot of the styles were pretty unfamiliar, and therefore I was inefficient, I was slow, and I was exhausted. The first time, it took me 6 days to reach the summit of El Cap via the Golden Gate, and I fell a lot. But each time I fell, I returned to the beginning of the pitch and climbed again until I succeeded. And that's how big wall free climbing works. You're allowed to fall, but you have to return back to the start of each pitch and climb it cleanly. And in 2015, when I reached the summit of El Cap via the Golden Gate over 6 days, that was one of my proudest achievements. For me, it was absolutely at my limit. But right afterwards, I started thinking a little bit bigger, and I started thinking that maybe I wanted to do what I had done in 6 days in under 24 hours. Free climbing El Cap in a day really distills the experience down into pure climbing. So you're not living on the wall, you're not sleeping on the wall, you don't have all this stuff with you. There's a different set of logistics required, but on that one day, it is only about the climbing, and you're having one huge day of climbing, which is truly what I love. I love going out and getting crushed and finding your perceived limit and then still finding a way to continue and keep going. I spent years training and preparing to free Golden Gate in under 24 hours. I did a lot of general fitness training, and I spent a lot more time on El Cap itself. I climbed on Golden Gate dozens of days with dozens of random partners. I spent a lot of time rehearsing sections, revisiting the hardest pitches, just kind of like whittling away at becoming faster and more efficient and climbing sections over and over and over again. Sometimes I would hike around to the top and rappel in from above to try the harder sections at the top. There were a lot of days when I went up there, and honestly, I couldn't even fathom the idea of climbing the entire thing in a day. There were days when I really thought that it would be impossible for me. And sometimes I would go up there alone if I didn't have a partner, and I'd use a self-belaying system to practice. And those days were probably the loneliest days. Those days were the days where I felt truly paralyzed by fear and anxiety and the exposure, and days that I really questioned if it was something that I truly wanted to do and if it was worth all the time and effort I was putting into it. And practicing alone can work just fine or with random partners, but on the actual day, having a good partner is essential. Much like over the multi-day ascent, but even more so, they have to be really fast, really efficient, and really capable. And there's only a handful of people who are qualified to support an El Cap free in a day ascent. Fortunately for me, Alex Honnold, star of the movie Free Solo, is a dear friend of mine and probably the most capable and fastest El Cap climber who's ever lived. He agreed to support me on all of my attempts over the years, so I was really fortunate for that. You could say that I tried to free the Golden Gate in a day 4 times total, but that was stretched out between long periods of time where I spent weeks just practicing individual sections of the route. So each try was a result of weeks of preparation, trying to find the perfect day to give it my one shot. And those attempts are really exhausting. So I was really only capable of trying once or twice per season. And then usually in the fall, a snowstorm, and in the spring, the heat from the summer would close the season down, and I would have to wait for the next season. In the fall of 2019, I had a breakthrough try. It was my second try after an unsuccessful attempt the previous spring. And I made it all the way up to the white X there in the photo, up to about 2,900 feet. So pretty close to the end. And essentially, I reached the final hard pitch. This pitch is called the A5 Traverse. It is a very steep rail where you kind of traverse almost completely relying on your arms. And after 15 hours of climbing, I just didn't have the strength anymore. I was only a couple hundred feet from the top, but truly I was only 20 feet to easy climbing. And I knew that if I had gotten through that 20-foot section, I most certainly would have gotten to the top, but that's not what happened.
Good heel back, come on. Come on. Come on.
Come on.
There you go.
Oh fuck. I don't fucking have it, you guys. I don't have it. I'm just too tired.
So yeah, I was really tired. I was wrecked. It was heartbreaking, honestly, but I was encouraged. It was kind of an epiphany, honestly. It was that moment where I realized that this impossible dream was actually possible for me, that I could actually do it. So I set out again to try that year. But like all things that are hard, progress is not linear. and it doesn't come easy. So this time I had the opposite experience. I don't even know if you can see the X, but it's down at the very, very bottom of the red line. I slipped about 30 minutes into the climb. It was 4:30 in the morning. I was trying to move really fast over easier terrain that I'd never fallen on. My feet were super numb, and I was taking a higher level of risk in order to move quicker. So I wasn't placing as much protection as I probably could have. And I fell about 50 feet and impacted on a ledge before the rope could catch me. It was definitely the scariest, most traumatizing thing that's ever happened to me in all my 24 years of climbing. It was a very serious accident. I hit my head, I lost consciousness, I had severe back and neck pain. I was immediately evacuated on a backboard and taken to the hospital with a lot of concern about a spinal cord injury.
Stable now, huh? Yeah. Hang in there, Em. Yeah,
But I got lucky. I walked out of the hospital that day after every X-ray, CT scan, MRI that could possibly be done, and I had just a concussion and some pretty intense but superficial cuts and bruises. I was super shaken mentally. I was still not deterred. I didn't want to give up, and I was looking forward to spring of 2020. But it did take months to kind of like recover mentally from that accident and feel confident and ready to climb again. But of course, we all just went through 2020. Spring came and COVID hit, and the world turned upside down. One small result was Yosemite was closed, and we were all confined to our homes trying to find direction in a chaotic world. So I did what most everyone else did. I was trying to get creative and do my job from home. So I spent a lot of time doing this in order to prepare for this. It was a very long spring and summer. But honestly, one silver lining of that was that I trained harder than ever before, and I had very few distractions. I wasn't traveling or anything like that. So this was all I was thinking about, and it sort of helped guide me throughout that time. I returned in the fall this past year after several more weeks of preparing in Yosemite, rehearsing sections again, and I found a day. I started up Golden Gate on November 4th, 2020 at 1:34 a.m. And this was my fourth attempt. And this time I had a little bit different strategy when it comes to partners. I had Alex Honnold for the beginning and I had Adrian for the end. So Alex would support me at the beginning all the way until about 300 feet from the top. The climbing down lower is much faster because it's not only easier, but I would also not be as tired. And Alex is so fast and he's so capable that he would just be able to move really efficiently with me. And then about 3/4 of the way up, Adrian would take over for when it got really emotionally tough and slower. Adrian likes to say that I traded Alex's speed for his empathy, which is totally true. I needed that emotional support of my person, my life partner, when I really had to dig deep. And my day could not have started out more perfectly. I was moving well, I was faster, I was more confident than ever before. It was truly magical.
Good, that's it. Another inch. Perfect. Really good.
That's it, come on. Really good.
Come on.
Really good.
Come on.
Nice, man, relax.
So everything was going well. And I reached the point just below my high point of last year, about 2,900 feet off the ground. I wasn't that tired. Everything was right. Everything was perfect even. But we all know how dangerous it is to think that something's perfect because perfect just doesn't exist. I was 12 hours in, it was midday, and the wall was a complete oven. One thing about El Cap is it's pretty south facing, so it's in the sun a lot and it just bakes. And one thing about climbing in the sun and the heat is that it's not good. It gets really hard. The friction gets bad. The rubber on our shoes gets soft. Your skin sweats and slides, and everything is harder. And I could have waited for shade, but I was really anxious to get back to the point that I had reached last year. I really wanted to get back to my high point so that I could focus. And I slipped off the wall and I took a fall. And as I was falling, I didn't think that it would be anything bad. I thought that it would just be a normal fall and the rope would catch me and it would be fine. But then all of a sudden the world went black and I felt the wet, sticky blood pouring down my face and into my eyes. And I'd come off the wall sideways and I'd hit my head pretty hard. I saw stars. I had this decent sized hole in my forehead. I still have a scar. And it was just like the accident from the year before, and all the failures just came rushing back. My confidence was shattered. All of a sudden I felt tired. I felt lethargic. I didn't want to climb anymore. And I was afraid. The fear that I'd worked through and felt like I had understood so well just returned. And I wanted to give up. This video is from right after Adrian and my filmer John did first aid, and they assessed me for a concussion, which I had no symptoms of a concussion, thankfully. But I was super drained. I was 14 hours in at this point, and I had all these conflicting emotions. I knew I was capable. I knew I deserved it, but I felt crushed and I felt exhausted. I wasn't willing to give up, but I kind of wanted to give up. And I just knew that it would be easier to just quit. But I also knew that this was part of why I chose this goal. I was to test myself when it got hard. And this was a moment when I really needed my team, when climbing became less about the individual and more about the collective effort. This is the video footage of John and Adrian kind of trying to lift me back up after the fall and give me confidence. I'm not sure if I could have done it on my own in that moment.
I think you've got more try in you. You know I'd tell you if I didn't. I think you can do this.
I think you got a lot of fight in you.
You just don't look exhausted. You're not threatening.
No.
I'm not. So with my team behind me, I gave myself an ultimatum. And I told myself, just try once more, take it one move at a time. It's all you have to do. And think about only what's in front of you. And I went back up there and I had, I think, what you could describe as like the flow state. It was this complete out of body experience that I've never had before. It was like watching myself climb. And mentally I had no stress. I had no expectations. I was just like existing there, and I was more present than I think I've ever been in my entire life. Like nothing mattered but exactly what was in front of me. And I no longer was thinking about success or failure. And from that point on, it truly was magic, and it was perfect.
Oh my god. Okay. Keep going. Yeah, it's epic shit. Yeah.
Okay, come on. Come on. Come on.
You know this. Come on.
Come on. Finish it.
Oh my god.
Yeah!
Shit!
Yeah. You did it. I'm so proud of you. You worked so hard.
I did it in a day. A little bit to spare.
So 21 hours, 13 minutes, 51 seconds. And the end of a chapter of my life. It was the culmination of years of preparing and training and trying, even when success felt so far off, when nothing felt possible. My time on Golden Gate just felt like this huge stretch of doubt and fear and discomfort and so much failure. And there were so many days when I went up there and I just couldn't fathom the idea of doing it in a day. There were so many heartbreaking and even terrifying moments that made me question whether it was worth it. But I was so drawn to the challenge and the inspiration of it that I kept trying despite the tears and the blood that I spilled over that piece of rock. It can seem a little bit pointless when you break it down, but that process of finding my limit, trying the impossible, being creative, and then leaning on my team gave me so much more meaning than I ever thought it could. And in the end, it was less about the objective itself and more about that search to find my limit and push beyond that perceived edge and just go a little bit further. And the changes that I went through as a person and the partnerships that I formed as a result are why it came to mean so much to me personally. And it's why I spend a lot of my time now sharing this story with others, because I believe that impossible challenges and fear and failure and discomfort are not things that we should shy away from. They're things that we should embrace and utilize so that we can reach our full potential as humans for ourselves and for the people we touch along the way. So I hope you found some of that in my story today. Thank you guys for being here, and I really look forward to sharing some of your questions.
Emily, that presentation was so inspirational, and I have no background in climbing, but I think the thing that I took away the most from your presentation was how applicable all of the climbing experiences that you have are to a lot of the experiences that all of us face in our everyday lives as human beings. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. It was so inspirational, makes me want to be a climber. It was really, really cool. So thank you so much for sharing. We have lots of questions for you, and so I will try to get through as many as we can, but I will start off with one of the members of the audience says, how many times did you climb El Capitan before the November 4th climb?
Well, like I said in the presentation, it's kind of a tricky answer. I climbed El Cap probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 times, like in total from the bottom to the top. But I spent a lot of time like practicing individual sections of the wall. So not climbing all the way. Like sometimes I'd climb up a third of the way and then I'd come down. Sometimes I'd go up to the top and I'd climb and I'd rappel down a third of the way and then I'd climb out and walk back down. So I've spent like dozens of days on the wall, but in its entirety, I've probably only climbed it like 6 or 7 times.
Awesome. And then the next question somebody says is, as a pro athlete, what would you say are the most important aspects of training for big goals and objectives? For example, is it cardio, strength, weightlifting, or something else?
Yeah, so training as a professional athlete, and especially as a professional climber, and for this goal in particular, it was kind of everything. You know, I like to compare free climbing El Cap in a day to like trying to run an ultra marathon, and then at the very end, you have to like run 100 meters really, really fast. So you kind of have to have fitness for everything. And for me,
Yeah.
you know, there's not that many people that have free climbed El Cap in a day. There's no roadmap. There's no like specific playbook on how to train for it. And there's maybe only 25 or so people that have done it total. So for everyone, it's different. And for me and my body size, it was a different experience. And so I spent a lot of time experimenting, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out something that would work for me. And I would say some of the most important things I learned were to be versatile. So mix it up so you don't get bored. And to be organized. So with my training, I had always had a plan. And it was always like, you know, even if you have like a lot of other things going on, if you block out this chunk of time and prioritize it, that's also something I learned in college. It's like, okay, I have these 2 hours and I'm going to do this, 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 and this, and this. And I'm going to like write it out and be organized about it. So I've found that really mixing it up, and with rock climbing, you kind of need everything, cardio, strength, it's a lot. And so I've found to be organized and to mix it up. And then the third and most important thing that I think we just don't appreciate that much is rest. So resting is really important as a professional athlete. That's when you recover and get stronger. And for me, that's actually something I struggle with the most. It's probably my weakness. So I try to really focus on that.
Emily, you and I share that. I get a lot of that same feedback from a lot of my mentors. It's just take a break, Kavya.
Exactly.
No, that makes a lot of sense. The next audience member says, Emily, I'm currently a senior trying to figure out what to do next and feel pretty optimistic about all the possibilities. I've recently been trying to satiate my delayed obsession with adventuring in the outdoors. What's your advice to someone who is trying to get into intimidating cult-like outdoor sports and activities?
Advice for someone trying to get into outdoor sports activities. I would say find a local community that you can kind of experience those outdoor adventures with. And even like a local guide service is actually a great way to do that. A lot of local climbing gyms operate with guide services, and you'll find ways to get outside and learn the skills that you need in order to play in the outdoors responsibly and safely. So that would be my recommendation. And then also, yeah, finding other people in the community that are passionate about that as well, that you can go out and learn with and learn from.
Yeah, awesome. The next question is, what does it feel like to have become so well known for something that started out as something that was your passion and your hobby?
Yeah, I guess, I've been climbing for 24 years now, and it's sort of been my career for a long time at this point. So I guess I would say I'm used to it. But I think, I think as I've climbed, it's really evolved from this hobby and this passion and something that I just really wanted to be the best at, to something much more than that. It's my lifestyle. It's how I connect with other people. It's how I see the world. And so it's become really all encompassing, I guess, is what I would say. And how does it feel? I think, honestly, I'm really proud that I've managed to turn something that I was super passionate about as a child into a career. And I'm really proud of that. And I think, right now, one of the most valuable things that I do is have a voice and share my story with people, and hopefully they get something positive out of it. And that's probably the most rewarding part of it.
Yeah, I can tell you that I think a lot of us are, even if we are climbers or we're not, I think your story is really inspirational in a lot of ways. So thank you again for sharing. And so the next question is, what was the closest near death or potential fatal climb?
Closest near death or potential fatal climb was the accident that I had in 2019. And that, yeah, I do like to say and tell people that 99% of the climbing that I do is actually very safe. I think climbing is a very safe activity if you choose it to be. It kind of just depends. It's a lot about risk and willingness to take risk, and I think there's a huge spectrum on that when it comes to climbing. And I went 24 years without having a serious accident. And that one particular accident, I was very aware of the fact that I was taking a higher level of risk than I normally do. And to me, it was worth the risk because this was something that I had been dreaming about for years. It was sort of a life achievement. And so I was very calculated about that risk. And that was definitely the closest I've come to being very, very seriously injured. And I learned a lot as a result.
Yeah, that was so scary watching. It was like we were there with you. So scary. And then this question is from our audience watching on Facebook Live. They're saying, what is your favorite traditional area beside Eldo in Colorado?
My favorite traditional climbing area besides Eldo. So I grew up in Boulder. I actually live in California now. So my favorite traditional climbing area would probably be Yosemite, but I live in Tahoe, and there's a really great climbing area called Donner Summit, which is actually where I learned how to trad climb, because when I lived in Boulder, I basically only climbed in the gym and did competitions and sport climbs.
Okay, gotcha. And then the next question is, how has your relationship to climbing changed since it's become the center of your life?
Yeah, so I guess going back to what I was saying about how when I was younger, I was really focused on climbing competitions. And for me, it was this very narrow-minded view of what climbing was. Climbing was a sport to be the best at. And as I grew older, my relationship to climbing evolved quite dramatically. It became my career, it became my identity, it became my lifestyle, and it became my vehicle for experiencing the world and for experiencing life as a human. Essentially, it was how I formed my partnerships, my friendships. It was how I was able to travel the world. It's now how I make money. It's how I communicate with people. It's the story I tell. So it's just become so much more than just a sport to me. And so I think that's been the biggest difference. And I'm sure that it will continue to evolve as I grow older, as I decide to have a family. I think that my relationship with it will change.
Will keep changing. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The next question is, how do you control your thoughts and actions when confronted with fear or even panic when you're climbing?
Yeah, I love talking about fear. I think it's a really, really interesting topic. And the way that I think about fear is, I think it's a very normal thing. I think it's a very normal emotion. And I think it's a very misunderstood thing. I think a lot of people think that people like me who rock climb and do things that are perceived as scary or dangerous don't feel fear, or we don't have fear, or we somehow have conquered our fears. And I just don't think that that's true. I can honestly say that I feel fear a lot. And the way that I like to think about it is I try to not be afraid of fear. So I try to not fear my fear. And I think that fearing fear is what causes panic. That's what leads to panic. It's like you feel afraid and you're like, oh no, I shouldn't feel afraid. Oh no, what am I doing? Oh no, this isn't for me. And then that's when you start to spiral, and that's when panic ensues. But when I get afraid, I tend to let myself be afraid. I almost like personify it. It's like, oh, okay, the fear is here. I've felt this before. Hello, we're going to sit here for a minute. We're going to think about this. We're going to try to understand why it's here. Sometimes it's here for a real reason. Sometimes it's here because there is something dangerous going on. Sometimes it's here because I'm afraid of failing. And then that, we go down a different path. And so what I try to do with feeling afraid and with that type of emotion is I try to sit with it and allow it to exist, and then take these baby steps to kind of push that comfort zone a little bit, just like a little bit beyond the line of comfort until that place of discomfort and fear feels comfortable. And then I push it a little bit further and the line just keeps moving. And I think that's how we grow, and that's how we learn about ourselves, is by feeling those uncomfortable things and dealing with them instead of trying to beat them. Because a lot of times trying to beat your emotions out of you just leads to a lot of shame and guilt, and I think it's pretty counterproductive. So what I try to tell people is that it's actually a very normal emotion, and we all feel it, and it's part of being a human, and it's an important part.
And I think something that I'm hearing from you is like about being vulnerable and the power of that, because I think a lot of us lose sight of that and being vulnerable with our own emotions because we're so focused on our goals. So I think hearing that from you, especially such an accomplished climber, I think just helps normalize it more and hopefully continues destigmatizing talking about failure and fear. And so kind of on that same topic, we talk a lot about failure on the Herd Leadership Council. And so the next question is about, how do you stay motivated when you have so many failures in reaching that hard climbing goal?
Yeah, this is a great question. Topic of failure. Climbing is probably 99% failure. I have a laundry list of failures, of things that are left unfinished. And I think that how I stay motivated is you kind of have to shift your mindset and shift your perspective on failure. Failure is actually a very good thing for us, and failure is something that teaches us a lot as human beings. And being a climber, you can't really be a climber without failing a lot, without understanding what failure is, and without really embracing it, and without being prepared to fail. I mean, in analyzing my ascent of Golden Gate, I think what eventually enabled me to be successful, like I had this vision of having this perfect day where everything was flawless and nothing went wrong and I was perfect and I did everything right. And in a way, it kind of like didn't really leave me space to try hard and really put myself out there and really go out there and be willing to fail. And it wasn't until I entered that flow state and didn't have those expectations and wasn't thinking about success or failure, that I was able to kind of let go of all the expectations and be really present and in the moment. And I think in a lot of ways, thinking about something as a success or a failure is a little bit too black and white. We don't live our lives that way. And I think living and existing in that gray area where a lot of times you're trying something and it's not working out, and then you take another path and see if that works out. And a lot of times those dead ends and those failures are where we learn the most. So I think that's where my motivation comes from. My motivation actually comes from like just failing a lot and then learning from it and realizing that is why I do it. Like that's the whole reason I'm here doing what I'm doing. Also, Golden Gate was one success for me, but I still have endless failures, and I've learned a lot from them.
Yeah.
And I will continue to do so.
Right. Yeah. And I think all of us do. It's just hard to see failure that way as like a motivating force, I think. But hearing that from you is really, really inspirational. And so the next question is from an audience member who started climbing at the age of 51. They ask if you could describe the transition to outdoor climbing and how you recommend they connect with more experienced climbers. In the reverse, we also have an audience member with a 10-year-old climber. So any advice for her?
Okay, great. Well, first of all, my answer is pretty similar for both. I really truly believe that climbing is for everyone. Climbing is a sport that you can start at any age and get a lot out of it. And in terms of transitioning to the outdoors, I mean, luckily now there are, and hopefully in the next, months or year or so, the climbing gyms will be able to open up and operate more normally. But climbing gyms are a great place for resources for getting outside. Like I said, a lot of climbing gyms have guide services. A lot of climbing gyms have programs that teach you about going from the gym to the crag and the differences. So I would recommend looking at your local climbing gym and asking if they have a program like that, or if they have a guide service that they operate with. And then for kids, the thing that was really valuable for me is when I first started climbing at the gym, I joined the local junior climbing team. And so I was climbing with other kids my age, and we had coaches, and they actually took us outdoors and exposed us to outdoor climbing. And those were some of the most formative and important lessons for me, was learned on the junior climbing team. And I learned how to climb outdoors.
That's awesome. That's really cool. The next question is, what's your experience breaking stereotypes as a woman in a male dominant sport? Were there any obstacles that you faced throughout your career that your male counterparts did not?
This is a really great question. The one thing that I grew up in Boulder, and one thing that I didn't include in my keynote was the very first person to free climb El Capitan a day was a woman, and her name was Lynn Hill, and she did it in 1994. And at the time, that was truly something that people thought was not possible. They thought that it was so far beyond what anyone could envision. And she was the very first person to do it. And there's this classic line when she reached the summit, and the quote is, "It goes, boys." And growing up in Boulder, Lynn she actually lives in Boulder. And I knew of her when I first started climbing. I got to climb with her. I got to know her. And for me as a young girl, I knew about that achievement, and I didn't understand what it meant. Like, I didn't quite grasp what that achievement was, but I knew that it was something groundbreaking. And I knew that it was pioneered by a woman. And that to me was very important. So I actually would say that I had a lot of really powerful influences and mentors who were women in climbing. And when I first started climbing, I felt like it was a place for women, and I felt like women could excel. And not only that, but climbing is an extremely complex sport. It requires physical strength and mental strength, and it requires a lot of body awareness, and it requires a lot of flexibility, and it requires a lot of things that it caters to all different body types and body sizes. And therefore a lot of things that are strengths for men and weaknesses for women might be opposite and still you can still excel in climbing, because it is something that requires such a full body experience and a mental experience. And therefore, I think, you know, I struggled a little bit at certain times. Like, I was the only girl on the junior climbing team and stuff like that. And I grew up climbing with boys, and still to this day, like, I really crave climbing with women. I love climbing with women. I find it to be a different experience than climbing with men. But I wouldn't say that I felt like there was a stereotype, really, because there are a lot of examples of women who absolutely crush in climbing who came before me. And hopefully I'm just sort of like continuing with that legacy and that understanding and inspiring other young women.
Yeah, that's incredible. I know that being a woman is really big part of everything that I do too. And so just hearing that stigma is something that you're trying to erase too with everything that you're doing is really, really empowering and really cool to hear. So thank you for sharing that. And here's a technical question for you. Do you have a favorite type of rock to climb, or a favorite type of climbing, like slab or overhung or crack?
That's a really hard one for me. I would say I do have a favorite type of rock. I actually grew up climbing. One of the first places I rock climbed was this area called Rifle Canyon. It's in Rifle, Colorado. Some of you may have heard of it. And it's this limestone canyon, and it's super overhanging. And the limestone is like really blocky and kind of like three-dimensional. And the climbing there is really full body. And it's really hard to read and hard to understand. It's almost like you have to make your body fit in the rock in order to ascend. And that's probably my favorite style of climbing, simply because it's where I learned, and it's a little bit nostalgic. And so I always try to make it back there every once in a while if I can.
Yeah, that's really cool. And okay, so unfortunately, we only have time for a few more questions. Our apologies for those questions that were not answered. We just had so many. But we had a lot of questions about you not having a helmet on in your videos. So could you address that for the audience?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. And this kind of goes back to my discussion of risk. When I talk about risk, I use the helmet thing as an example. I actually climb with a helmet on El Cap the majority of the time that I am up there. But wearing a helmet for the in-a-day ascent was actually quite cumbersome. There's a lot of sections where the helmet gets stuck, like really stuck, and you have to take it off. I climbed a lot at night, and when you're climbing at night with a helmet and a headlamp on, it sticks out really far from the wall, and it actually bumps the wall, and the headlamp moves. And so I actually practiced a lot with a helmet, and ultimately decided that for my one day that it was actually going to hinder me enough that it was worth not wearing it. And obviously I paid for that because I did hit my head, and I think I might make a different decision next time, but it's not it's not a risk that I took without thinking about it prior to that. So I would say 90% of the time that I'm on El Cap rehearsing moves on a multi-day ascent, stuff like that, I was wearing a helmet. But when I was trying to go for the in a day, moving really quickly in terrain where a lot of times you're having to take the helmet on and off, and also it's really hard to climb the harder pitches wearing a helmet as well, once again, because it gets in the way and you can't see as well. I ultimately chose to not wear it on the day. And that's something that most people who free climb El Cap in a day have made the same decision as me, but I did get unlucky and I did hit my head, and I think that it's something to think very carefully about in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. Then our next question is, one of CU's big initiatives is to put an increased emphasis on student mental health and well-being through programs, awareness, and outreach. What do you do to support your own mental health, and how do you prepare mentally for a really big climb?
Yeah, so something that I wish I had done sooner. I do therapy, and I think that that's really, really helpful, just to sort of like talk through mental health issues. So that's been really beneficial for me. And then another thing I guess it's more of like a mantra, and I use it when I climb as well as just in daily life. Like I try to not like shame myself for feeling a certain way. Kind of going back to the idea of fear. I try to not be hard on myself for feeling certain ways, like for feeling angry or frustrated or being afraid of failure. All these things, like all of those things are very valid things to feel. And I think it's very counterproductive when you are hard on yourself for those things. So I try to be really aware of that. And then the third thing that I've been learning more about, and that we talked about earlier, is resting and kind of rolling with the punches, I guess, when I don't feel like climbing, or when I'm not feeling motivated, or when I'm feeling a little bit aimless, or like right now I just finished with this big goal and it's hard to figure out what's next. And mentally that's a little bit of a challenge. And I think being okay with that aimlessness and being okay with sometimes just not doing anything and not having a direction is better for my mental health in the long run. So I think like getting help, but then also just being accepting of who I am and what I'm feeling has been really important. Just more of like a shift in perspective, I would say.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I think a lot of us could benefit from that, seeing things in a different way and not being too hard on yourself for your emotions. I think that's a really, really great point. But kind of going along that question, what are your goals now? Do you have a new climbing goal?
I have an endless list of climbing goals. Golden Gate was just one thing. Like I said, there's a lot of failures in there. And yeah, I have a couple ideas for things that I'd like to do in the future. Right now, I really just want to train to get stronger, like overall.
Yeah.
And I'm supporting my fiance, Adrian, on his climbing goal because he supported me so much through the years, and now it's sort of like his turn. So I'm playing that support role at the moment, and then also training and climbing for myself. And hopefully we'll get to do a big trip this summer if we're allowed to travel again. And Adrian and I'll get to do something together.
That's so cool. Well, we had over 30 questions that we couldn't get to tonight. Again, thank you all for your participation tonight. We absolutely loved having you. And our very last question for you, Emily, is what is your favorite memory at CU, and what to you does it mean to be a Forever Buff?
Okay, yeah. So I actually feel like I've been a buff since I was a very, very young child. Being born and raised in Boulder, I was always going to CU Buff football games. I never had a plan B. I was always going to go to CU. That was just what I wanted to do. So I've always sort of felt this like sense of belonging there, and still do. And there's a really cool connection I feel with people who have been to CU or go to CU, and I see them on my travels. And so for me, it's really reminiscent of a lot of formative years of my life. I think, that was a time and a place where I learned a lot about who I was, and I learned about what was important to me, and it was really formative for my climbing career, and I'm really grateful for my time there.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Well, we are out of time. I'd like to first thank you, Emily, for joining us this evening. It was so wonderful to meet you, to hear about your stories, your experiences, and how you conquer a lot of the same emotions that we as students, adults, humans face in our everyday lives. So thank you so much. Thank you to our audience, both on Zoom and Facebook Live, for joining us and submitting your questions. We apologize that we didn't get through all the questions, but we really hope that you enjoyed spending time with Emily tonight. And thank you to all of our partners for putting this program together: the CU Boulder Alumni Association, the HERD, and new student and family programs. The goal of events like this are to build CU pride and foster connection to CU Boulder, and we really hope that you stay connected. Keep an eye out for future Forever Buff Spotlight events by visiting our website, www.colorado.edu/alumni/events, and follow us on our social media channels at CU Boulder Alumni and at CU HERD. Thank you so much, and go Buffs.
Thanks, you guys.